Hello everyone and welcome to another episode here on The Learning Droid. In this episode we're going to be doing a very large pyrography on country plank, which is plank with bark on either side. As you can see in the video, I'm prepping it now, sanding it down. That's because it came rough cut from a sawmill. I would tell you what kind of wood it is, all I know is it's soft fruit. I don't actually know the exact kind of wood because we didn't know it was an offcut from the sawmill. Country plank is wood with bark on either side, and I actually stabilise it with cyanoacrylate to stop the bark coming off later. In the preparation, it's sanding it down with a belt sander, an auto sander and hand sanding, cleaning the wood off and putting cyanoacrylate across the back. This is the biggest piece I've ever done. It's a metre by 30 centimetres approximately, and it's got a bit of a story behind it. The person who commissioned it, who is the person who provided the original design, had requested the design from another pyrographer and had requested it back in January as a item to use during a wedding. Now, come July, this pyrographer had turned around and told him that it wasn't going to be able to do the pyrography in question, do the piece, and the person actually approached me and asked me if I could do it before the end of July when the wedding was. So I dashed round, contacted several different wood mills, and if you're looking for wood, the best place to go is to contact the wood mills. I got a couple of negative responses here and there, but eventually I went off to Whitney Sawmill, which is a sawmill a short distance away from where I live, and I just got in contact with the person who was in charge of the saw shed, and he took me over to the offcuts, and we had a little bit of a shifty through, and I managed to find the right sort of piece. This is the patterning section. I used a combination of pin and scratch patterning and laser ink transfer patterning, and the pattern of course was provided by the person who asked for the piece originally. It comprised several different elements that were important to the couple that are getting married. A dragon, her personal symbol, the word love, a kind of natural design whale made out of leaves and feathers, a tribalistic owl, a swirling saxophone and some musical notes. Altogether, the design was a little bit spotty, but it looked quite nice when it was finished, and it was all very important and very specific to the couple that were getting married, which is one of the most important things about making pyrography for other people, is you have to make it for them. So I did change the positioning of a few pieces from the original design because of course the plank shape was different because it was country plank, but the person who asked for it did say they wanted something with the bark on, so we had to adjust the design to fit into the shape that was provided. On the back, at the end, I did fix a pair of picture frame hook hangers because the person said they wanted to hang it in the house after the wedding. So to give them something to hang it from, there's a set of picture frame hook hangers on standaways, which are small blocks of wood to stop the bark getting damaged. It's a really nice story. I loved doing the piece. It was really fun to do. It was a little bit difficult getting everything together in time and finding the time to do it because there were a few other things going on. Our cats had surgery, so there was looking after the cats because they were trying to rip the stitches out. All sorts of great fun things going on all at once. But the actual piece itself was quite good to do. Because the piece was so large, as I said, a metre by 30 centimetres, with smaller pieces pyrographers tend to rotate the piece, but I couldn't rotate the piece here, so you'll see later on in the burning video that I actually do a long shot so you can see that I'm standing up and I'm actually moving around the piece and moving my body around the piece instead of rotating the piece, because it's a little bit easier with something this size. So we're on to the burn now. There are 5 different sets of images on the screen. The top one is the dragon burn, and it will change perspective as we go. There's a couple of issues with shadow and things because of the lighting. A lot of this was done at about 2 o'clock in the morning, so it was done a lot with lighting from LED light bulbs rather than from natural light, which of course means that it's a little bit less diffuse, so there are a few shadows going on when we're burning, but as it changes perspective you'll get to see a few different things. Next to it is the burn of the personal symbol, which is a rock with a flame coming out of it, and the whale. Bottom left we've got the saxophone going on, and in the bottom centre we've got one of the small action pieces, and I believe, is that right? I believe that will be the lettering, and then in the bottom right we have the tribalistic owl going on. and that will go into oh no, that won't go into it. The bottom left will go into the musical notes. It was done with a combination of machines. It was done with a Walnut Hollow Creative Versatool, but a lot of it was done with the Peter Child's Pyrography machine. The bits I used varied. I used the spear point bit for edging and for sharp edges. For broad areas I used, for the first time ever actually, I used a brick tip, which is a square edge tip. I also used a round edge tip, or a ball edge tip for the musical notes, and I used a fine point tip for the saxophone. For the dragon and the whale I used spear point tips. The square tip came in on the lettering and the tribalistic owl, because there was a lot of dark colouring to do on that. That tribalistic owl also used a spear point tip for the finer edges and finer details. So there's a big combination of different bits. If you go back into my catalogue, there are videos on how to make all these different tips using wire, using just folding wire, because the wire tip machine, if you have an open wire tip machine, which means you can put your own wire tips in, your own homemade wire tips, then you can make all of the tips I used here. And in fact, all of the tips I used here were handmade by myself, and I keep a little box of them ready in case I need them. It was great to be able to use some of the rarer used tips, the square edge tip, or the square tip, and the round tip, which are very rarely used on the smaller pieces I do. I do an awful lot of small pieces, but it's very uncommon for me to get the opportunity to do the large pieces that require things like the square edge tip. Some people, for the letters and for the large areas, would have used a coil tip. I did think about using a coil tip, but I've had bad experiences with coil tips. I find them very hard to control. But a square edge tip actually does the same job, and I find it much easier to control, much easier to get a smooth, clean burn rather than a ridged burn. So I think it just came out better in the end doing it that way. As I said, most of this was burnt in like 2 o'clock in the morning, 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and was burnt in sections, burnt in pieces when I could get the time together. The wedding that this was being done for was taking place on the 30th of July, so I'd like to congratulate the couple, and I hope the wedding went really well. I hope everyone got completely and utterly stonkered and had a great time. Okay, maybe not. Maybe I just hope they had a great time. It's not necessarily important to get drunk, but it's great fun. The piece was going to be placed on the wedding arbour, and that's one of the reasons why the hanging point on the back was important. As you can see with the burn, it's all about slow, smooth movements. When it comes to filling in an area, small, gentle circles, and just working with the piece. This piece, the bark had some variation in density, and the wood had some variation in density among the grain, and there was some variation in density where some mould that had gotten into the original tree and changed the density of the wood. That had all been killed off by the drying process at the sawmill, but it had left some changes in density in the wood and some changes in how the wood responded to being burnt. I did also have a little bit of overburn, a little bit of burn wash, where the heat from the bit washes out and darkens areas of the wood that I didn't want it to darken. But in my personal opinion, while I didn't like it, it wasn't something I could remove, and sanding down deep enough to remove it was not really an option. I did talk to the guy who commissioned it, or the guy who asked for it, before handing it over, but he was fine with it, and he thought it added a little bit of character to the piece. It's one of these things where the artist is always going to be very critical of their own work. We see every single flaw, we see every single mistake we made, we know every single point where we went off pattern, and the person we're giving it to, or the person we're making it for, doesn't necessarily see those things, and they just see the piece of work or the piece of art that they wanted. And that's it. If the person that it's being given to is happy, then that's all we really want. I hope everyone will join me in congratulating the couple getting married, and I hope that the everything went well. The issue with bark on edge wood is it's very hard to get hold of, because the bark, naturally as the wood dries in the drying house, the bark falls off. I was very lucky to get this piece, and as I said, what you have to do in this case is, if you want to keep the bark on, you have to do what's called stabilizing, where you use some kind of binding agent and also a waterproof finish. The waterproof finish prevents the bark from drying any further, and the stabilizing adhesive on the back, or the stabilizing chemical, binds the wood to the bark. In this case I used cyanoacrylate, which soaks into the bark and soaks into the wood really well and will bind the two together very strongly. Unfortunately it stains the wood, so it's only been done across the back, but it's been done quite heavily across the back, so it's soaked in quite deeply. So there is staining on the back. On the back there's also a burn that has the couple's names and the date they've got married, and also a small burn of my new symbol for my website, which is my pyrography website is called Fire Bunny, so it's a little pair of fire, a little pair of fires for ears, and a little tribalistic rabbit face. But it's the back of the piece, and the staining is kind of necessary because it has to we have to bind the bark on. The finish given to it is several layers of an acrylic-based interior varnish, waterproof interior varnish, and while it was painted onto the main piece of the wood, it was stipple brushed into the bark, so it's gone all the way into the depth of the bark. Now I chose to use satin because, in my personal opinion, if you use matte on the bark, then when it dries it can still look quite dirty. The bark actually looks quite dirty right up until the point when it's been varnished. Even though it was washed and cleaned, it was looking quite dirty. But with the satin varnish on, the satin slight gloss over the top, it looks much cleaner and it looks much nicer. That's a personal opinion matter. Some people like to go with full gloss, some people like to go with matte. Personally, I much prefer a satin look, especially on a bark edged wood. As I said, in my opinion, the satin look makes it look a lot cleaner. To apply, as you're going to see in a second, so we'll go over, as to the applying of the varnish and the applying of the different elements of varnish, I just used a couple of different brushes, a can of interior varnish, and it got several coats in the end. Each coat took about 20 to 25 minutes to apply, because the stippling into the bark, and because the stippling into the bark left small pools, each coat took about 4 or 5 hours to dry off, even though the drying time was an hour. Remember, if you're varnishing on an uneven surface, if you're varnishing on an uneven surface and you're going to get pooling and sort of areas where it's thicker, it's going to take a lot longer to dry, so leave time for that. Otherwise, the piece came off really nice, and I'm quite happy with it, as was the person it was done for. So, thanks for watching everyone, and I will see you again next time.